The question for us is, now that we're in a second debt crisis, can we see a third debt crisis coming up again? Is Africa going to be in perpetual debt? I think we need to be asking these questions because we have to think in the long term on the basis of the experiences that we've had historically. Then we can project whether or not we should, in fact, expect a third one and even a fourth one. The AfCoDD question to me was, can Africa achieve debt sustainability under neoliberalism? So I said, neoliberalism. Well, first of all, neoliberalism has changed quite a lot. It's different in how it's applied in UK and France. It's even different from how it is applied to us by the IMF, for example. So I didn't think that looking at neoliberalism as a framework of analysis was most appropriate. Besides that, the structuralist thinking predates neoliberalism. And neoliberalism also does not say anything about history and the nature of power relationships of Africa in the global context. So I decided that I would examine this question through the structuralist center-periphery school theory and its offshoot of the dependency and underdevelopment theory. I believe that it is very important to have a development theory, but a development theory that gives you an idea of your concrete reality, both in time and space, but also gives you a sense of which direction you should be going. The center-periphery theory and dependency and underdevelopment was very predominant in the early 70s and 80s. And it made a lot of sense to many of us. But today, most of the universities, even in Africa, are not teaching this development theory. It has disappeared, partly because we were overtaken by this neoliberalism. And there's nothing wrong in reimagining and rethinking and going back to our certain thought processes and certain development theories if they can be more useful in helping us understand our concrete reality. For that reason, I decided that I would take the discussion through debt. The title would be Debt Sustainability in the Context of African Dependency and Underdevelopment. So in terms of the discussion, therefore, I thought, I will spend a few minutes on this theoretical framework, the structuralist center-periphery theory and the offshoot of dependency and transformation. And I'll be mentioning some names that some of you already know: Raoul Prebisch, Hans Singer, André Gunda-Frank, and Thomas Clive, not to mention Samir Amin, who worked, a bright African scholar who worked in Dakar. So I'll try to quickly sketch that with your indulgence. And then I'll try to use that in many different kind of ways as I look at the debt crisis, the first debt crisis, and how it was resolved. In that regard, I'm going to look at the underlying causes of the first debt crisis, and then move on to the conditions which led to its resolution. And that in that context, I will look at the post-war, post-Second War development context and the global civil society transcontinental action, which was very, very strong and actually had an influence on that. I will look at the HIPIC and MDR processes very briefly, only to say that, to see the process which went on and was resolved in 1999 up to 2005, if you like. After that, there was a completely changing development context. About development aid, development effectiveness, and we ended up again in a second debt crisis, which you might say started around or was beginning to manifest seriously in 2020. And then I'll just kind of make some conclusions on the way forward. Now, just looking quickly on the theoretical framework and the structuralist school, I think the starting order for Africa, I mean, we have a very long history, but our starting order in terms of structuralism should be the colonial order. And I beg your indulgence for repeating this, because it's very, very important to see whether these structures in fact have changed or not changed. So historically, the colonial order, which was composed of the imperial countries and colonies, was specifically characterized by the following. It was characterized by economic exploitation. The colonies were sources of raw material on which they had no control over the price. Even today, Africa is selling material, we have no control over the price. That's a very weird situation to be in. Then we start wondering why we were poor. There was cheap labor, and we as colonies were a market for capital goods and manufactured goods made in the imperial country. In order for that exploitation to take place, there was a high level of political control. The laws and regulations and policies were determined by imperial powers and imposed on colonies. So the local population had no decision making. Now we have to see today if Africa still has any decision making. Okay? There was cultural dominance. Imperial countries imposed their norms and language and values, leading to suppression of or marginalization of local cultures, traditions and practices, including traditional knowledge around science and technology and medicine. There were social hierarchies which were created by the order, colonial order. It reinforced hierarchies in which Europeans were occupying privileged positions to the marginalization of local people. And today you still see these kind of hierarchies. You know, you go to Europe, you got say an African, they say, oh, so who are you? You know? But once you say that I have a PhD from McGill, then everybody's, oh, then you're okay. So that hierarchy and all that kind of still remains even after 50 years. Then there was exploitative labor practices during the colonial order, including primitive accumulation. Okay, so in observing all this, the structuralist school, especially led by the Latin American school of Raul Prebisch, but also with Hans Singer, who was originally Swedish, I think, but an English person working in the UN. They tried to categorize this order, that world order which they were seeing, and described it basically as global capitalism. And within that global capitalism, they said that there were two groups, two categories. You have the center and you have the periphery. The center comprised of the industrialized countries with strong economies, advanced technology, financial muscle, political power, control, and strong institutions. The periphery, on the other hand, were less developed countries providing minerals and raw materials, low wages, limited access to markets of the center, and the periphery countries were highly dependent on the center for the attributes that I've just talked about. Furthermore, Prebisch and Singer noted in their what they call the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis that the terms of trade of primary commodities tend to decline over time compared to manufactured goods. And in any case, just the prices of primary commodities tend to decline over time due to, for example, technological innovations. So if you are producing something where there's some technological advances, then the demand for that goes down. And since African countries have been so dependent on primary commodities, you can see what the consequences of remaining trapped in primary commodities can be. Now, during the 1960s, here comes decolonization. African countries became independent. There was some very high expectation. There was vibrance. Okay, we're going to break away from this very oppressive system. The global market changed. The global map, sorry, the map changed. From this is France and these are its colonies, this is England and these are its colonies in red or blue, whatever it was. Oh, yes, sorry. We all were individual countries now, single countries. But at that point, they gave us a label. The label was, these are developing countries and these are advanced countries. So we get a new label. Those in the periphery were then labeled developing countries. And the development theory around that was this trajectory, linear trajectory, that these developing countries, one day, they will also become like developed countries. All they need to do is modernize and remove internal constraints. Or they have low labor skills, the infrastructure is poor, this and that and that. So once they get these things sorted out, they will become like advanced countries. They will become developed. But after independence, although there was a lot of enthusiasm for change, and it took a long time, most of these structures actually remained in place. You'll be surprised, or maybe not surprised, that even today, many African countries, they've still got colonial laws on their statutes. And in the hierarchy, I was coming into Dakar, no offense here, I was coming into Dakar, I was coming in with a friend with a Dutch passport. They walked in straight in. And me, I had to be taken back and say, no, you have to find it to have a visa. And this is my continent, okay? This is very, very sad. Where is this coming from? Huh? A Dutch person walks in, and I'm an African, and I'm stopped that you must have a visa. Then somebody said to me, oh, but you didn't pay for it. I said, okay, I didn't pay for it, but what do I need a visa? This is my continent. So you can see that history is very important, that we have not shed a lot of what baggage that we've carried, even after 50 years of our independence. By the way, it's not only about Senegal. That situation is across the continent. It's not about Senegal. After independence, the African countries, with their enthusiasm, they were facing many choices. So they said, some of them said, oh, we want to do capitalism, you know. Oh, no, we want to do socialism. You know, the Tanzanians and their Ujamaa and all this. And then others, the more progressives, if you like, said, let's create the African Union now, the Federation of African States, the United States. Let's create it now so that we have a big market from the outset. And then that way we can strategize, not sending our raw materials to the outside. Because the excuse was that there was no market. But the others said, no. Let's first develop our national states. And when our national states become strong, that's when we will become united. And that never happened. Okay? The good thing about this is that the conflict to resolve these two groups, what we call the Casablanca group, which was much more radical, and the Monrovia group, which was more nationalistic. In 1963, they decided that they would create the Organization of African Unity, which turned into the African Union today. But you can see that that was coming from this confusion after independence and so on and so forth. I did mention that the prevailing theory, development theory at that time, was a more linear one, that all these countries have to do is modernize and they'll become like developed countries. So the dependency and underdevelopment school, the structural school by Andrea Goodman-Frank said, no, the poverty that you are seeing today in these countries is not due to internal factors, but rather to the historical fact that these countries had experienced, that underdevelopment and poverty were actually not because of those internal constraints, but the result of history and ongoing relationship between the center and the periphery. The level, in fact, we talked about this, there's one form of dependency, that the level of development in the center was based on the continued exploitation of the periphery through trade, through dominance of multinational corporations, through debt, and various subtle ways of control through their institutions. We'll talk about the IMF and devaluations and therefore making Africa poorer and all this kind of stuff. These are institutions of the center which were serving the interest of the center. So Andrea Goodman-Frank said that no, there's no linearity here. There's the concept of underdevelopment. Underdevelopment is not a stage in the development process. Underdevelopment is the situation in which you have forces which are working against you and restraining you from moving yourself forward. All African countries understand, and we all know that we have a lot of poverty on this continent. And we want to solve that poverty constraint. And there are certain things that probably we want to do. But there are these forces which are always pushing us backward. And we need to recognize those forces. Unless we do that, we will not go anywhere in the next 100 years. So, Frank proposed that the periphery countries should break away from global capitalism. We're talking about global capitalism here. And let's not forget that. If they were to secure things. And he was talking during, we're talking 1966, 67. And at that time, because it was a critique of capitalism, they all thought that we should go towards socialism. I'm not sure we agree with that at the moment. But I think we can agree with the notion of breaking away from processes and institutions that put us under the situation in which we are. Samir Amin, I mentioned Samir Amin, he introduced the notion of delinking. And it was kind of a beautiful concept, I think. Come Thomas Clive. Thomas Clive was a Guyanan political economist. He worked in Dar es Salaam for a little bit, but also following in the footsteps of the structuralist school and following in the footsteps of André Gunder Frank in particular. In his book in 1974, Dependency and Transformation, Economic Transition to Socialism, I said everybody at that time was thinking about socialism. Okay? And Thomas said, underdevelopment is the lack of an organic link between the use of African resources to meet the needs of Africans. And that Africa exports jobs and value through incomplete value chains. So let me take the example of copper. You have, on the input side, you have capital goods. Capital goods are a big industry which employs thousands and thousands of people in the north. So all that capital goods is imported. So we're losing jobs, we're losing money. It's not as if we're incapable of making capital goods. People say, the neoliberals say, oh, you know, Africa, you still can't make inputs, you can't make big trucks. It's easier just to import it. I mean, just export your stuff and import these things. That's a very neoliberal school, but we should not be swayed by that because our inability to make inputs, capital goods, takes away jobs and so on. In fact, what is even worse is that these goods are made from ingredients which we have given away as raw material. It's like giving someone all ingredients you need to make a cake. That person makes a cake, then comes to sell to you, makes a cake and comes to you and sells it at a higher price. It doesn't make sense. You're losing value. You're losing value. Equally, on the output side, you have copper, and you're exporting copper ingots, and in Europe, they set up new industries, 10 industries, to manufacture copper pipes, to manufacture copper wire and all that. And then we have to buy those things. So you're losing value, you're losing employment opportunities. So in a way, you will never have a sustainable debt because you're transferring value. So Clive Thomas says that the easiest thing to do is industrialize. And industrialization depends on science and technology. That we can develop, we can enhance science and technology. Not ready-made. What is the definition of science and technology? Science is the understanding of the laws of nature. Understanding biochemistry, If you boil this one, you do this, this is what you get. So you have science, which is the knowledge of nature. Technology is the ability to use science to make something which enables you to solve your need. Right? So it's not rocket science in terms of conception. So Thomas Clive suggested that we must industrialize as the case. So he then, using Samara Min's word, which I like better, that we must delink from processes and institutions which are hindering us from doing this kind of thing. We must delink our minds from ideas which say, no, Africa can't do it. Just import it from outside. Those guys have a better technology. Nobody says the North has better technology. I'm not saying that. But it's different from saying that we are capable. We are more than capable of making these things. So, done with that thinking, that theoretical framework, okay? So I try to see what is in this thinking, in this theoretical framework, and how do I apply it to my situation. When I think of the first debt crisis, many people say, and there's a lot of literature around it, and they say, okay, the main cause of the debt crisis was poor infrastructure in Africa, corruption, poor government management of resources, misallocation of resources. You hear a lot of that. Well, there's some kind of, well, it's not some kind, there is truth in that as well. Right? And then external factors, they say Africa is unable, inability to deal with the oil shocks, high interest rates, unfavorable conditions, and so on. So it becomes a very general thing. But when you look at the structural causes of the debt crisis, then you begin to realize that those exploitative systems which were created were still in place. 1980, African governments had not had the chance for any transformation. They started import substitution, even that was not even import substitution for production. Some of the ones started making cars and stuff like that. And we still continue to depend on selling raw materials at a price over which we had no control. Can you imagine you are in debt? You're a tomato farmer, right? So you take your box of tomatoes to the market tomorrow. Somebody pays you $100. And you go happy to back home. I'll feed my family. I'll pay my friend $10 which I owe him. I'll do this and I'll do that. So next time you go to the market with your same box of tomatoes, they tell you it's only $50. Take it or leave it. That's the situation in which Africa has been for many years. So now you have $50, you're walking back home, scratching your head and saying, how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to pay debt? How am I going to do this? And here comes your nice friend, the IMF, and says, Opa, you're in trouble. Okay, I can give you some money. I'll give you $50, a loan. So now, if I had a loan of $12 billion, the IMF, the first thing they do is give me another loan on top of that, which is $1.3 billion. So you can see very clearly there that there's something wrong there. Okay? So they're actually already building up on your debt stock. We have to see that it's not an instrument of the peripheries. It's an instrument which serves the interest of the center. The collapse of primary commodities. We're talking about this thing about your tomato price goes to 50. During that period, during the 80s, there was a very serious decline in primary commodities. This caused a very serious problem for African countries to be able to pay back their debt. The devaluation also of the US dollar caused manufacturing prices of goods, manufactured goods, to go up by 44%. So you can imagine your primary commodity prices collapsed, except for oil, of course. I mean, oil during that time, oil prices were up. So your goods, your prices go down, and you are not able. The price of whatever you want to import, manufactured goods for your industries, is up. So in fact, it resulted in capacity problem. What is the problem here? The problem is that you're selling something, you're giving away jobs, you're selling something over which you can't decide. Now there are institutions which are supposed to help us, right, with this kind of thing, with price issues in the market. UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Organization, was actually established by the UN on the instigation of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. They said, look, we cannot continue to supply raw materials. Can we find a way in which we also have a say over that? And, well, UNCTAD is the UN organization. We have a lot of Africans employed there too. But the fact is that UNCTAD is just concerned about stabilizing, how can we best stabilize raw material prices? That doesn't solve our problem. So again, you can see that although it is a nice idea that UNCTAD is there, Africa is part of it, well, I'm not quite sure. You just have to examine to see if it's actually serving our interest or not. There's no doubt that we have a very weak African state. When I say African state, I'm referring to the collective. Right? Some are probably better than others. But when I say African state, I'm talking about the collective. We have a relatively very weak African state. And in that case, we were not even able, and it was able to accept even illegitimate odious debts. We in the NGO sector thought that we could persuade the creditors that this loan is odious, this is illegitimate, it must be written off, but it didn't work. So by 1992, most countries were seriously in debt, this thing was resolved by what I have called the post-war World War II development context and civil society. So let me just talk quickly about that. I'm not monitoring my time, but I hope I'm not over. Yeah. The post-war development context is an interesting one, because after the Second World War, there was a lot of development optimism, you know. There was a lot of solidarity between peoples of the North and peoples of the South. Some of you might remember that we had volunteers, or what we call development workers, from Europe, from everywhere, working in Africa. They were everywhere. They really, really seriously were volunteering and trying to help Africa grow. You know? Some of you know about PISCO and CUSO, all these volunteers who came to teach science, mathematics, all these kind of, in various schools in Africa. But further to that, in 1968, McNamara the World Bank project governor then, the president then, worked together with the UNDP to set up what they called the Pearson Commission on International Development. So this commission was led by Lester Pearson, who had just completed this term as Canadian Prime Minister. And in 1969, the Pearson Commission came up with a report saying that there was need to intensify international economic cooperation. There was more need for debt, but development aid, not debt, development aid, and that there should be a reasonable way for technological transfer, and that domestic resources should be increased, and that there should be a very fair and equitable trade policies. So this vibe was very strong, you know, and actually it's this same vibe which enabled us from Africa to confidently talk about debt cancellation. Right? It's that vibe because the context was there. Equally, talking about solidarity, there's civil society organizations from various places, both from the periphery and from the north, we bonded very well. We bonded very well in calling for debt cancellation from, I would say, 1992 to 2000. But the Jubilee 2000 movement was the more galvanizing force. Now, I need to mention that we were all kind of standing on different platforms, even if we were working strongly together. The African NGOs were accounting for debt cancellation on the premise that there was this development cooperation context, that our northern friends, northern governments were interested in ensuring that Africa would also develop. I don't think we had this idea of this exploitative capitalist system. The northern NGOs were mainly made up of anti-poverty groups and looking for equal world. They were part of the North. They were privileged, but they didn't have an obligation. Although they came to us because they could see that actually the current world order was not so great. So they came out and said, no, we should work together and call for debt cancellation. The interesting thing is that the northern NGOs were the ones who opened up the doors for us to be able to campaign or to advocate with northern governments and various institutions. So as ourselves as African NGOs, we really just didn't have any power. We did, you needed AfCoDD needed Eurodad to be able to go to talk to the Dutch government. You see? So that sometimes was a little bit annoying, I must say. And in the meantime, at the same time, there were some more radical groups in the US, like the 50 years is enough, because they thought that 50 years of Bretton Woods institution was not really making progress. So, but the fact which has been recorded today is that civil society action on the Bretton Woods institutions just didn't work. These guys are tough. They can bring you in the house and say, yes, we're going to reform. But, so I think that history needs to be understood. The Jubilee movement made a strong appeal on moral grounds, which was a little bit not so good for us as Africans, because we were put in this category that they were saying, oh, every 50 years you must declare Jubilee and free your slaves and the poor people, so we must forgive these people there. And it really felt very bad for me as an African. Am I being treated, my colleagues in the North, that I'm a poor person and therefore the government must forgive our our debt. So it really felt very, very bad. So that means that we need a more equal world. We need to work differently. Africa has to have power to be able to open doors itself rather than suffer this kind of thing. Anyway, the Jubilee 2000 managed to get 17 million votes, which we delivered in Cologne in the summer of 1999, and that just changed everything. So that's when the HIPIC Debt Initiative was born. So kudos to our friends, and we thank them for the cooperation and support they gave us. Very quickly, the road to HIPIC itself was not a very, it was a long one. By 1980s already, African countries were queuing up to the Paris Club for debt rescheduling. But the persistent weak commodity prices in the late 80s revealed that the problem was much, much deeper. So the G7, the highly industrialized countries, took on to make the decisions. Again, it was the decisions of the G7. In any case, there were various processes, and I won't go into that. They're in the paper. So that after the summer of 1999, they came up with the HIPIC project, HIPIC initiative, which provided debt cancellation for that. Until that time, the multilaterals were sacred cows. But again, in Glen Eagles in Canada, I think, the G7 made a decision that there would be multilateral debt cancellation in 2005. So by the time we get to 2008, when we were having the financial crisis, most African countries were kind of okay, except for Chad, which was still completing reaching its completion point. So after that, there's been a very serious change in the environment. In the year 2000, there was already beginning to be doubts about the value of development aid. So the OECD Secretariat set up the OECD Working Group on Development Aid, and in the year 2000, in Rome, they said, okay, the Africans were complaining that the reason why aid hasn't been effective was that the donors were not totally coordinated. So it was agreed in 2003 in Rome that the donors must be more coordinated or harmonized. So harmonization programs started. In 2005, the African countries had said, yeah, okay, you guys are harmonized, but we are not in the driver's seat. You still come to us and tell us what to do. So in the Paris Declaration of 2005, it was agreed that, okay, you are the ones who are in the driver's seat. We'll give you the money, but we must have a discussion. Right? We must have a discussion how you're using the money and the outcomes, all this kind of stuff. That system didn't really work very well. We had a lot of theft, we had a lot of corruption, so the donors said, now what do we do? In 2008 in Accra, they said, okay, let's have a plan of action. And they made a plan of action. In 2010, there was an evaluation of that, and that plan of action, which had been agreed on, was not successful. So in 2011, in Busan, they said, this thing of development aid is not working. So they told African countries, look to private sector, look to other sources, do South-South cooperation, look to the BRICS for your financing. And 2012, the working group, the OECD working group, was abandoned. After that, many development agencies closed their offices in Africa. There's 3 countries, CEDA, the Dutch, and they didn't close the embassies fully. They left trade people. So that you can consider was the end of development aid in a way. Okay? But these documents, when you read them, they are quoted in a nice language, you know. Oh, we shall continue to cooperate with each other, you know, we're committed, da, 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 da. So you really have to be careful when you're reading these documents because some messages are clear, but then they're quoted in nice words. Okay? Well, quickly also that there was another parallel process which started in Monterrey in 2002, which was about financing for development. Again, there were problems with that. In 2015 in Addis Ababa, the African countries were told that the responsibility of debt sustainability is on the borrower. Okay? You see how this begins to shift now. They are telling us that, and it's true, I mean, we as Africans have to take that responsibility rather than thinking that we can go begging and stuff like that. And that we should pay attention to sources of finance and development of science and technology for the transformation. Quickly. The second debt crisis, I'm not going to go into detail with the second crisis, but it's a bit heartening sometimes to hear people saying, well, second debt crisis, African countries were not able to do this, you know, COVID-19, and now we have the Ukraine war, all this kind of stuff. These are all recent things. We forget about the structural changes. Has Africa really changed structurally? And the answer is no. That's why our income base is still low. So it wouldn't be surprising that we're not able to meet any shocks because we have not transformed for many years now. I want to conclude by saying that Africa is still struggling in the periphery of the global capitalist system. It is in the periphery. It's not anywhere in the center. And therefore, it remains dependent and it remains underdeveloped. Remember what I said about the underdevelopment? There are still a lot of forces which undermine our transformation processes. And we need to identify those and work against them. If we are to be a rule maker, before that, nothing will happen. So in a way, I like to use the word delink. Africa must delink. But from what? From ideas, processes, structures, and institutions that replicate and reinforce dependency and underdevelopment. There are new opportunities. Sorry, I don't want to be misunderstood that tomorrow we delink from so and so. It's a process. We have to figure out what kind of process. We need to be clear that these processes currently are not working for us. Then we strategize, how do we delink and how long will it take us? There are new opportunities and alternatives out there. The BRICS framework, for example, provides a new thing. I was just wondering with the BRICS, because BRICS, you know, now Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all these guys with money are coming in. The question is, how do we engage with these people? Are we going to have the same relationship we have with them as we've had with the other guys? Otherwise, then it won't work. So it has to be, if we are to go with those guys, all we're doing is shifting the center. China becomes our center instead of Britain. Russia becomes our center instead of some, just about the same conditions. So we have to be cautious and we have to really gauge what kind of relationship we can have them. Is it going to be an equal relationship? Is it going to be structurally different? And then, of course, one can talk about more effective and deeper DRM, including illicit financial flows, which my colleague talked about. And the multinational corporations are the culprit to these things. We should engage our diaspora because Africa is big. and harness diaspora resources in ways. But overall, we need a strong development state. And we have to work toward creating that strong development state, which would have the courage to help us with the transformation process. Thank you.